For more interviews on educational technology and for a list of our technology workshops, please visit www.edtechlive.com. To join the discussion on School 2.0, please visit www.school20.net.
The leadership, from the school board to the superintendent down to our cabinet, is very quickly coming to the realization that we can't do business as we've done it in the past if we want to continue to challenge all our students, but also provide our students the opportunity to achieve it at the highest level that they're capable of doing. I think we're seeing the fact that students, in their way of communicating, when they leave our classrooms, that's when their true learning sometimes begins. We've got to make sure that we're leveraging how they're learning when they leave our classrooms. So many of us grew up in a classroom where we were given the knowledge, if you will. We weren't allowed to create the knowledge based on our experiences or based on our ability to find information. That's got to change, and training is a big part of making that change happen. The students, when they leave our classrooms, self-manage their own learning, their own collaboration. As we bring those kinds of environments within a classroom setting, how do we have that blend, if you will, of teacher management and student management? That is perhaps our greatest challenge right now, is to what degree can we place the responsibility of learning and the management of that learning on the individual student. And to make that work, our parents have to be a partner. They have to have a input into how that will work, and they have to believe that that's also the environment that their children are functioning outside of school in, so let's see how we can make it work inside of school. These students today are very adept at working together to find information and to create knowledge. What they're not adept at yet is knowing what questions are the best ones to ask before they go looking for that information. And yes, I firmly believe that in my thinking of reform, that our new collaborative tools, our Web 2.0 tools, will make the difference in having that happen in classrooms.
Hi, this is Steve Hargadon, and it's Friday, January 5th, 2007. And today my guest is Jim Hirsch, the Associate Superintendent for Technology and Academic Services at the Plano Independent School District in Texas. Good morning, Jim, and thanks for taking the time.
Good morning, Steve. It's my pleasure.
There was an eSchool News article recently in which you were quoted fairly extensively. Education 2.0. Do you remember the article?
Yes, I do.
So in that article, and I know that oftentimes quotes aren't entirely accurate, but it says that you're predicting that within 5 years there won't be a single desktop in your district that's running proprietary school software. Is that what you actually said? Do you think that's going to be true?
Well, it's awfully close. Where we're aiming, in fact, we have as a stated goal in our instruction and technology group, is to totally move away from our dependence on proprietary client-based software. We're moving totally into a web-based sphere now of delivery, so that we can provide opportunities for our students, not only here in a school setting, but certainly in any setting outside of school, so that we can extend our learning day, but just as importantly, that we can extend that learning to devices other than a typical PC that they might find in the classroom or at home, because we realize our students are now connected in a whole variety of ways, through friends, through their public libraries, but even through the phone that they may be carrying in their pocket. And so my goal for my staff is to work with vendors and get them to understand that we no longer can be saddled with the ability to install software on a single machine, access that software only when we're at a particular machine or on a particular network, and we have to move everything into the web environment. Now, much of that will come outside of proprietary software. It will come through open frameworks that have been built or collaborative events that are occurring now between educators and students, not just in the United States, but throughout the world.
So when I've talked to educators about these new technologies and their potential to transform education, usually what I hear is that they're very excited about them, but they get a lot of pushback from the district level. So what's happening differently in Plano where you're actively promoting these technologies?
That's a great question, because that is true in so many school systems. It's almost a groundswell in terms of new and innovative technology uses. We've been fortunate in the way that we've organized our delivery of services to our schools and our students. We're a relatively large school system, 53,000 for a suburban school district. Of that, we're 2 years away from becoming a majority minority. We've got a quickly growing low-income population. So our whole district has been in transition, quick transition, for about the last 5 years, and we'll see that continuing. And so the leadership, from the school board to the superintendent down to our cabinet, is very quickly coming to the realization that we can't do business as we've done it in the past if we want to continue to challenge all our students, but also provide our students the opportunity to achieve it at the highest level that they're capable of doing. And that means that we can't allow, if you will, haphazard use of resources in the hopes that they may make a difference. We're doing our research studies. We're doing our collaborative creation, if you will, of curricular materials as well as instructional strategies at a central level using teachers in a collaborative mode, so that once we do complete any activity, that then is provided to every classroom in our school district, so that every student, no matter what the bricks on the outside of the building may look like, is going to receive the same opportunities for high quality instruction and high quality use of instructional materials in their classroom. That's the greatest promise we can give our community, is that equitable access of all of their children to these resources. And so that's why I think in our sense, we've had some success looking at this from a district perspective rather than waiting this to become a groundswell, if you will.
Well, those of us who've been in technology or in education for the last 20 years, I think we've all felt like there's been this continued promise of technology transforming education that never has seemed to be fully realized. Are these new technologies going to do something different than has been done before?
Steve, our plan is yes. We're going to enable and leverage these technologies in ways that haven't been typical. I agree with you and most of the people you've spoken with it. As we look at the technology du jour, almost, if you will, that have been placed in classrooms, there's always been the placement with the hope, without the planning behind that hope, if you will. And I think what I'm seeing more of now, really throughout the country, as I work with other school systems around the country, is that people are stepping back and now taking a much better look at planning before they implement, and not necessarily saying, I've got some grant money or I've got some additional funding left over yet this budget year, let me quickly spend it. They're trying to now put the plan in front and say, how can we truly embed these resources? How can we leverage what our students bring to us in ways that we haven't done before? And that means thinking a little bit differently in terms of how our classrooms operate on a regular basis. And so you'll now see some low-cost technologies that have high impact that are starting to be adopted, whether it's something as simple as a wireless keyboard in a classroom, which allows every student in the class to participate and lead the discussion on that classroom computer without having to get up and move. In other words, the keyboard can be passed to them. Low-cost software that allows teachers to annotate those high points in a conversation, or allows a student to highlight their presentation and save that as web pages, without having to go to the extreme cost of putting in a digital chalkboard, if you will, that once again puts all the focus at the front of the classroom versus having the focus on the students. I think we're seeing the fact that students in their way of communicating, when they leave our classrooms, that's when their true learning sometimes begins. We've got to make sure that we're leveraging how they're learning when they leave our classrooms. And that's not to say that every student has the same access, but all students have some access, whether that's going home and they have a cable TV, but more and more often, even our lowest income families are having cell phones as their communication service because they're not able to keep landline service for a whole variety of economic reasons. But they do keep in contact with their relatives and their friends using cell phones. And so we're looking at those services that can leverage even cell phone use. And that's why it's so important for us to think, what can we do from a web standpoint as well? What can we do to look at learning objects so that they're smart enough that they can format themselves for the device that they're being delivered to. In other words, leverage what we have in our school classrooms, leverage what a student might have in their homes, but also leverage what a student might have in their pocket.
What I hear you saying that's so encouraging is that you're looking for ways to actively engage the students. Is that accurate?
That is absolutely the case. We've talked and read about student-centered learning for a long while, but to actually implement that takes a significant amount of planning, and it also takes a significant amount of training on the parts of our teachers, because so many of us grew up in a classroom where we were given the knowledge, if you will. We weren't allowed to create the knowledge based on our experiences or based on our ability to find information. That's got to change, and training is a big part of making that change happen.
So I'd like to talk to you about the training, and especially because I've been to your Sockwell Center and seen the commitment that you have to creating training resources. But before we go there, can you give me a quick understanding of how the parents of the students in your district are responding to these initiatives? Are they involved at this stage yet? Are you getting any pushback from parents?
At this point, the only pushback we might get is some parents who wish we could move more quickly and allow their students to bring resources that we're just not quite ready to support yet in a classroom. But I think by and large, our parents are interested in being more informed and more involved in their student learning. That can be as simple as the fact that we put a system in place now that can automatically generate an email message to a parent based on their selection of trigger points. In other words, if they want to know a particular thing about their children, whether it's that their grade has gone above a certain level, below a certain level, or that their attendance has reached a certain point in a class, they now can get to self-select, if you will, or self-serve those trigger points. And that email can be sent to whatever format they'd like to, whether it's a parent who has access at work, or they've gotten a free Hotmail account that they use at the public library, or they get email on their BlackBerry or their phone. These systems now can notify them. And I think parents appreciate what we're trying to do to make them a closer partner in the whole student learning process.
That makes a lot of sense. And so my guesses would be that the place where parents are typically going to react with some concern would be any time at which a student or information about a student is exposed. And what you're talking about those technologies don't necessarily expose the student to the outside world. They just create a facilitation of the relationship between the teachers, the students, and the parents.
Certainly. Yes, you've depicted that accurately, although a concern of our parents, but it's also a concern of ours as well as our student groups that we talk with, and that's as we bring more collaborative tools into play. How does that get managed, and how much of that needs to be self-managed by the students themselves? In other words, the students, when they leave our classrooms, self-manage their own learning, their own collaboration. As we bring those kinds of environments within a classroom setting, how do we have that blend, if you will, of teacher management and student management? That is perhaps our greatest challenge right now, is to what degree can we place the responsibility of learning and the management of that learning on the individual student? And to make that work, our parents have to be a partner. They have to have a input into how that will work, and they have to believe that that's also the environment that their children are functioning outside of school in, so let's see how we can make it work inside of school.
So it does sound like that you recognize and are actively trying to communicate with all these constituencies, recognizing that going through a process of change like this can be really difficult. So obviously you're communicating with the parents. How are the teachers responding?
Well, that's interesting. Because we involve our teachers intimately in our curriculum development process, I think what we're trying to do is, once again, gather that input because of our size from those teacher representatives, whether they're a team leader or a department chair. They fulfill those different roles, whether they're a high school versus an elementary school teacher. But we also then provide those leaders, if you will, with the leading edge of the information. Going back to training, that train-the-trainer mode, we provide our teacher leaders with the most up-to-date information and tools that we can, with the expectation then that they're going to bring them back to their teams, get input from their teams, but also provide that initial training and support for their teams. And so it's a very large collaborative process that involves literally hundreds of teacher leaders for this to work.
I was thinking the other day, there's so many new technologies and the changes are happening so quickly that it's kind of like going over Niagara Falls in a barrel. And how do you figure out what to train and what to work on, knowing that, a year from now, things could be dramatically different?
Right. That's a wonderful question and a great analogy. And I'd like to say that, we're 100% on this all the time, but the fact of the matter is, until we get a particular technology or strategy out in the hands of our teachers and our students, we cannot predict what those likely uses will be. It's almost like going back to the very early days when Broderbund first brought out Print Shop. They had an idea of what Print Shop would be used for, but it wasn't a matter of weeks, and all of a sudden you had people throughout communities as well as teachers using Print Shop and asking for improvements because of what they wanted to do, seeing the promise of that very simple tool, if you will. The same thing happens whenever we train or bring out a technology or an instructional strategy. We can't possibly predict how wide those implications will be, and so we have to be agile enough, and we have to have enough trust from our constituents that they're willing to give us input quickly and realize that input will be taken and a training will be adapted sometimes as quickly as over a single evening because of what we've learned.
What kind of technologies are you finding are getting adopted quickly and that you feel are really making a difference?
The technologies that are getting adapted and adopted most quickly are those that get into the hands of the students in the classroom, that allow them to present their information, gather their information, and collaborate on producing those things most quickly. The simplest thing, if you will, large group viewing, and we're fortunate because we've had large group viewing for quite a number of years, but I had a teacher tell me about 6 years ago when she first had a large group viewing device in her classroom. This one happened to be a projector, that was the single best media or technology instructional piece of equipment that had ever been placed in her hands. Now, when you talk to the students, and you're thinking, well, are they going to think the same way? The students were saying the same thing because they now also got a chance to deliver their creation, if you will, their knowledge, using that same technology in the classroom. In other words, it was technology placed in the classroom not just for the teacher, but also for the student. And so that's been a real key component of everything we do. When we put in a wireless keyboard and mouse, it's not for necessarily the convenience of the teacher. It's for the ability to engage students in their work area without asking them to move or get up and artificially go to a particular part of the classroom. And that I think is the key to success in anything we do with our teaching staff as well as with our students, that it truly does become a tool that allows students to become better engaged, but also that allows them to collaborate more efficiently and present their information more effectively.
So would it be fair to kind of divide this topic into two parts, one of which would be open source and open technologies, open source software and open technologies that are saving costs, and then technologies that are creating engagement?
I think, to be fair, we probably do have to divide it that way, but to be honest, we're not viewing it that way, if that makes sense, Steve. As we look at the whole education community, I think when we talk open technologies, open source, many people are still in that late 70s, early 80s, freeware, public domain kind of a frame of mind, versus really what the open technology is about, or the open source, is freedom. And it's not that it's coming without a cost, it's that you get freedoms when you're using that technology that you don't get when you're using a proprietary technology. And I think that's where we like to focus as we're considering this. So I hate to give you two answers for that, but I think one is probably the larger community answer, but one is our particular answer, where for us, it's not the cost that we have to separate from how we're actually going to use it and the strengths it brings to us, either in collaboration or our ability to blend it with other applications.
That makes a lot of sense. Are you using OpenOffice?
We have OpenOffice. What we're doing in our particular situation, we're working with Open Office in a limited number of schools right now because our current situation is, keep in mind, when we started the conversation, we had a 5-year goal, actually, which is now 3.5 years into that goal, of moving away from proprietary desktop client-based software. At this point in time, however, we still deliver to our students and our teachers literally hundreds of client-based software applications. And so in the case of moving to Open Office, for us, it needs to integrate with every other service we provide to our students and teachers. And so we've got a limited implementation to gauge exactly how deep we're going to need to go into other areas that we provide services and make changes so that it can be a successful implementation for any school. A good example of that is we have home-built or locally designed, if you will, curriculum planners. So the teacher goes into a classroom, a third grade teacher, they're going to pull up the recommended unit of study for that time period. They're going to pull up the recommended activity within that unit of study, and inside of that activity, they're going to see suggested procedures. They're going to see suggested resources. Those resources can be everything from a streaming video link to a web-based link to a link to a pre-built presentation, if you will, to a link that launches a software application. And Open Office, as an example, is one of its weakest points is its presentation module. And so in the curriculum planner, if a presentation is already embedded that has been built in PowerPoint, the teachers using Open Office will be able to open that presentation, but they may not be able to make use of some of the features of that presentation. And so what we're doing right now is we're identifying those pre-built resources, if you will, from our curriculum group and seeing which ones are fully compatible and which ones are only partially compatible with, in this particular instance, Open Office. And as we identify those, what we're trying to do, Steve, to make it successful for us is we don't want to have any unknown holes out there. Once we identify these, we can then determine, is it something that's critical or is it something that we can work around, either rebuild or give teachers alternatives. And so we're in the midst now of all of that information gathering before we bring Open Office out to other schools. In a different fashion, take a graphic image manipulation program, GIMP. It's much simpler for us as we're working with our elementary art teachers. And they now have a need to have a more advanced manipulation program to work with their students to determine, okay, do we need to go out and look at a proprietary solution or do we need to look at GIMP? Comparing the two and deciding we can roll out GIMP very quickly, very easily to every one of our sites in a mass implementation because the ramifications of other resources that it depends upon is not nearly as great. And so I don't know if that makes sense or not, but that's kind of where we're at right now in our process of blending open source or open technologies with our proprietary solutions.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I think what I heard you say was, Office has been so ubiquitous for so long that it's going to be entrenched at all different kinds of places in your curriculum where you have to be careful to make sure that you don't break something by substituting.
Yes, well put, exactly.
So what kind of a background do you have that has brought you to this point?
Well, Steve, I'm a lifelong educator. This is my 32nd year working in education, serving children and teachers. I was one of those early adopters, if you will, back in the mid-'70s. In fact, I started teaching before two hallmarks came about. In 1976, Apple introduced their Apple I and JVC introduced the VHS recorder. I was teaching before those even came about, so I've had the great fortune to see the embedding of a whole wide array of personal technologies as they became available. I had the opportunity to take a piece of equipment or a piece of software and say, gosh, how could this be used in education? And it was my hobby as well as my work, and I was fortunate enough as districts needed to get things consolidated or coordinated from an effort standpoint because there wasn't efficiency in letting each school buy equipment or buy software. And so district-wide positions were beginning to be put together. I was fortunate that my hobby became my job. And so I left the classroom after 11 years, and now for the past 21 years, I've been involved at a district-wide level supporting technology uses for instruction as well as for administration. And so my background really is self-taught. I remember the days of working with Roger Wagner and assembly lines when no one was really talking about assembly language except people in closets who were writing code, and we were beginning to bring that out and explore and learn about print drivers so that you could print from a particular software application to an Oki data printer where the software application couldn't recognize it. And so we'd look at writing print drivers that would allow that connection to occur. And so to some degree, many of the things I learned before the books were written, before the courses were put together as college or training courses. And I've tried always to kind of stay a little bit in front of that curve as much as possible.
A lot of people are combining the new web technologies with the concept of school reform. Is that an appropriate combination? Are these technologies such that they could actually help change schools? Do our schools need to be reformed?
Well, whether the schools need to be reformed, I think what does need to be reformed is our classroom environment and our teaching strategies. It's just too apparent, and it's been coming for some time, but it's too apparent that our students of today, because of the access that they have to media and to other network type of information, is that they no longer rely on a historical perspective to make decisions. They make decisions based on, first of all, their friends, and second of all, what they might be able to find on a network service. And I think that in itself is probably only about within the last 3 years. Prior to that, I think people were more inclined to say, well, let's go take a look at a search engine and see what it tells us. About 3 years ago, we really saw the flip going, let's go to my friends first, either through instant messaging or some other collaborative tool, see what my friends are thinking, and then let's see what we need to find somewhere else. And that needs to change what we're doing in our classrooms, because we don't always create our classrooms in such a way, or our learning activities in such a way, that we leverage what our students now are almost coming with us as a basic skill. Obviously, we don't assess that basic skill, but the fact of the matter is these students today are very adept at working together to find information and to create knowledge. What they're not adept at yet is knowing what questions are the best ones to ask before they go looking for that information. And so that's changing the role of our teachers. And so to answer your question in a long way, yes, I think reform is needed. Whether I'd call it school reform, I'm not sure how I would label it. But certainly from an instructional standpoint, we need to have that reform. And yes, I firmly believe that in my thinking of reform, that our new collaborative tools, our Web 2.0 tools, will make the difference in having that happen in classrooms.
Seems like there's a little bit of a paradox. Part of it is that the students are so engaged in technology outside of schools that you have to address some of the areas where they need help and guidance and direction in using those technologies. And so it's a little bit maybe of a response to what's happening outside the world and helping to make sure they're prepared to use those technologies well, at the same time recognizing that these technologies are so engaging that they really do change how all of us learn. I certainly learn differently because of them.
Yes, yeah. I couldn't have said it any better than you just did, Steve, at that point.
So are you using blogs or wikis at all?
We are at, I'm going to call it the infancy stage of blogs and wikis. Obviously, when commercial free sites became available, we had many teachers, and that was almost a groundswell. We had many teachers who said, you know what, I just heard about this. I think I'd like to see what I could do in my journalism class, for example, with this. And what we needed to do from our standpoint is like what we try and do often is let's not have our teachers go out and try and find their own solutions to what they think is a classroom need. Let's try and come up with a solution that will work best for our teachers in general. And so we host our own, if you will, blogs and wiki internally, rather than have them go out and go to the Blogspot or any other of the various services. And that's kind of been our philosophy as much as possible. And because of that, sometimes the high flyers don't get to go as quickly as they'd like to. I don't know if that makes sense or not. But then we try and leverage those teachers who have been most interested in helping us design internally what the service needs to look like so it will best serve them as well as their students. And so I'm saying we're in our infancy stage. It's not widespread. It's not written into the curriculum yet. And for us, because of the way we provide curriculum, once a resource or a technique is written into the curriculum, then it is systemic. And we're not quite at that point yet with the blogs or the wikis.
Well, it seems to me that especially with blogs, that you do address this issue of how clickable is a student. And that was a phrase that Will Richardson used recently that I had not heard before, but one that seemed to me to potentially ring alarm bells for district people,
right.
Which was, Will wants the student to be accessible to the outside world, so that he can learn from and participate in collaborative efforts outside of the classroom. And as a parent of children, I'm both excited by that and a little nervous about it.
Right.
So does producing your own structures for that allow you to kind of figure that out as you go along?
Oh, gosh. Thank you, Steve, because you picked up on something that I didn't mention. That really is one of the underlying reasons we try and then provide that internally, because that allows us to manage it in a way that seems most appropriate to our community. And by that I mean, we'll have multiple servers, and at that point we can choose to make the servers visible, if you will, to a local site, to the entire district internally, or to the community at large. And you brought up a wonderful point. Until we see an instructional need, we don't necessarily make it available. And so as we're looking initially at our use of collaborative tools such as a blog, they're all kept internal at this point in time.
Do you know which tools you're using? I mean, are you involved at that level that you could tell me, say for the use of blogs, which actual programs you're using?
Yes, we're using WordPress.
And I know that because we did a Moodle seminar there that you've got at least some interest in, or teachers using Moodle.
Yes, and we do have our own internal Moodle server, and in fact, our new development is all on Moodle. And since you were here, you probably know the history, since we've been doing online courses since February of 2000. Our initial development, as well as our initial course purchases, were all on a proprietary system. I've given the challenge to our group. Not only will all new development happen on Moodle, but I want to move our existing content over to Moodle. Now, if we had a great utility that could make that simpler, that would be wonderful. We just don't have that utility, and I haven't found that utility yet.
Well, maybe there's a challenge there for someone who's listening to the interview.
That would be great if there were.
How are your proprietary vendors responding to these initiatives?
It's interesting. First of all, to some degree, the first phone call is, have we done something wrong? And my answer to all of our vendors, so we've had great partnerships with this, absolutely not. You have not done anything wrong. But what we're looking for is a different environment. And you need to consider, how can your product or your service work with us in the new environment that we're trying to create? And so, unlike that quote that says we're going to get rid of all proprietary software, we're going to get rid of all proprietary desktop client-based software. But I'm still thinking there are going to be certain applications that are proprietary that have such great value to us, and because they're built on new technologies, allow them to be blended within a portal environment, for example, as well as make use of information services that we think are important in terms of what they can provide to software about students and their progress and achievement. We'll continue to work with those vendors. And so I'm just encouraging them to come into the conversation with us, hear what we're trying to accomplish, and decide if their product roadmap is going to continue to be able to work with us, or if it's going to be one of those situations where, like happens naturally, at some point in time, the product or service no longer provides value that makes it worthwhile us purchasing.
So schools aren't the only ones who are going through changes with regard to where the value lies from vendors. So what I hear you saying is, the model is changing. We're not exactly sure where the model is going. We're not averse to paying vendors for providing services, but it may not be in the same ways that we have in the past. because we need to make sure it fits with the new models of how we're using technology.
Again, you stated that very well, Steve. I'll just recount a conversation I had 2 weeks ago with a major publishing house. They're now trying to figure out how they can work with us in this new environment, because what we're looking for is the ability to deliver those learning assets at any time, in any shape, in any form that our teachers deem necessary to help in a student's learning process. And their license arrangements don't necessarily think that same way, because they haven't all chunked their assets into these learning objects. And what we're about is saying, and not only do you chunk those into learning objects, but make sure you're following standards such as SCORM or IMS, so that when we bring a product like Moodle in, and our teachers and our curriculum designers start building activities, it is going to be compliant. It can be used and reused efficiently. That's a new mindset, but that conversation is being had with the publishers now.
Yeah, I spoke the other day to a gentleman involved in educational technology decision-making here in California, and he felt that the transformation from book to electronic publishing was going to push a lot of the changes that would take place. So certainly there should be, we should see a lot, I think, because of that.
Right.
What Web 2.0 technologies are you using or looking at?
Well, in a number of different ways. First of all, I'm going to jump off the instructional side just for a moment and talk about some of the administrative things that we're also very involved with, because obviously the success of our administrative systems does have an impact on the success of our instructional systems as well. We've been involved in some local development of an ERP, or if you will, student finance and HR accounting system for some time, because we haven't been able to find a proprietary solution that met our needs in the way we wanted them to be met. And so that's quite a different step for a school system to make, if you will, because these systems are not easy to build, and particularly with our goal of it being totally web-based, Java-based, if you will, and accessible in a browser for functions that traditionally have been COBOL-based or RPG-based and have required a whole different level of programming. It's been kind of exciting how that works. Very early on, we knew that to get efficiency with the number of users we have, with the amount of data that we're keeping into a single database now, that we couldn't use traditional web programming. And so as we talk about the AJAX, the combining JavaScript and XML, we've leveraged that heavily throughout our development, so that as an office manager, a registrar, a teacher may be entering a value into a table that's been displayed now on a web screen. That table may have dozens of fields, and typically when you enter in a value, you're going to expect that's got to be checked and come back to you, and it's going to refresh the entire screen. That is way too much network traffic to happen efficiently. But by using some of the AJAX techniques, we can check that value with a business rule only in that single cell, and the rest of the screen, the rest of the fields, stay unchanged, if you will, or not needed to be updated in that fashion. That's been a huge efficiency model, and we're looking at that in every facet of our development, so that we can provide an efficient web-based tool, if you will, that no one else is building. At least I haven't been able to find through commercial services. But then as you get over to the instructional side, I think our key is going to be, again, the collaborative piece of that. We've been investigating now with Google purchasing Rightly as an example, and now going to purchase ThinkFree, as well as G-Office, and there's AJAX Office. There's a whole number of collaborative tools out there that are web-based. We're looking at the ramifications of providing applications to students in a web format only. What does that mean when they don't have access to a network connection? In other words, do we then look at the ability of these applications to save to a local file, student work on that file locally, and then bring it back, but then that takes some of the collaborative piece off? And so we have not jumped headlong instructionally yet into a lot of these Web 2.0 type technologies, but we're definitely investigating them, and we're going to find out where we feel the weaknesses of those may be, and then determine, is that a weakness we can overcome, is that a weakness we can compromise on, or is that a weakness that is so strong we have to look elsewhere?
I really appreciate your reminding me of the administrative aspects of this, because certainly the article from eSchool News pointed out that you and other schools have used open source programs from an administrative standpoint for a long time, and they have provided you with some real value. I guess the thing that's exciting for me about web-based technologies is the idea that a student potentially could have access to their work over the span of many, many years, because it's being stored on a server. At the same time, you've recognized that there is an inherent difficulty. The service is down. You've got 52,000 students dead in the water for that period of time. There are some other concerns that I hear that come up. One of which certainly is privacy, and the concern that a vendor has access to data which you may or may not want to be vulnerable because it's sitting with someone else. And the other is that you don't actually own the data. And a good example of that would be Flickr, where there's just some wonderful tools for combining with photographs annotations and other information about the photograph that would seem to me to make it a wonderful instructional tool. But you're experiencing lock-in. It's a different kind of lock-in, but it's still lock-in to a single vendor because that data, you can't pull that data out and take it somewhere else. Is that something that you've thought about at all?
That is a big concern, and it's part of all our discussions. And so, I mean, we're somewhat pleased with, for example, even though the Google offering isn't as robust as it's going to be, I'm sure, but the Google for desktops that they offer in an educational setting, where in essence you're hosting that locally. It's using those tools, but you're hosting the data locally. That is a model that we've used with vendors for some time. Vendors, a good example was United Learning when they came out with their United Streaming product many, many years ago. We were one of their first adopters, but one of our requirements was that we wouldn't want to run that in an ASP model. It had to be local. And we're doing that same work with every vendor. We have that exact same discussion, and for some vendors, they're not willing to have their services hosted locally for a variety of reasons. They like to update more frequently, whatever the case may be. And we've said no to some vendors and that we're not going to be able to work with you because we couldn't host it locally. Now, a small system may not have that same flexibility, and that's where your regional service centers or your other educational agencies need to really come up to speed on what schools are attempting to accomplish and be willing to say, okay, we can host it in a more secure and a more open fashion, if that makes sense to have both of those next to each other, for schools. Because it's not the vendor themselves or it's not the provider themselves, but it's a more localized version of that service. Now, when you do that, you lose some of the power of the collaborative service, and I think that's where the discussion still continues on, Steve.
Right. Is Google currently talking about providing that? Do they do that already?
They do provide a setting for schools, yes. Mm-hmm. But right now, its hallmark product is their Google email for students, if you will. That you can bring a Google email system in-house, house it totally within your environment. But again, it won't be long, as they've been moving so quickly on their collaborative tools, that whether it's docs and spreadsheets or it's going to be think-free, or they're going to be offering a more robust suite, if you will, to be hosted locally. Because I think they see that themselves. Not only do they don't want to continue to double their server farm, but they also realize that there are concerns from a privacy standpoint if this is truly going to be used in education.
That makes a lot of sense. I know, at least for me, I've been surprised at the degree to which my word processing needs are really simple enough that for a lot of what I do now, I do it in Google Docs because I have access to those documents wherever I am, and I've determined that there's a fair amount of functionality in a word processor that really isn't day-to-day use for me. Right.
I think that's true on almost all the applications that we deal with, which is what makes our conversation about using alternative applications, example open source applications, so much simpler. Because when you get right down to it, very few of us use more than 5% of the features in any software product any longer.
Are you using Linux on the desktop at all?
At this point in time, we're not using Linux at the desktop. Our Linux is relegated to our server farms, But we are working with the new ultramobile PC. We're working with a particular vendor to build a unit for our testing. We've got 120 units on order, with the idea being that those will be running Linux, because the applications that they'll be using will be primarily web-based applications or open source applications. So it's a particular use that we're looking at. So my answer, while today we're not running at the desktop, as we're looking at new implementations, that is a direction that we're definitely having as a requirement.
How many actual desktops do you have?
Within our system, we have right at about 31,000 desktops. That includes both a traditional desktop and our laptops.
So your ratio of computers to students is fairly high.
We're just a bit over 1 to 2, yes. One computer for every about 2.2 students.
I was really impressed when I visited, and again, a very limited visit, just visiting the Sockwell Center, but was really impressed with the professional aspect and demeanor of all involved, and with your obvious commitment to providing technology in positive ways. Jim, what books do you read? What's on your nightstand?
Well, Steve, I don't know that you want to hear this, because although I do try and read professional books, whether it's The World is Flat or whatever it might be, on my nightstand is going to be something, probably rereading a Philip K. Dick or a William Gibson or something that is definitely science fiction, whether it's a Cory Doctorow or one of his compatriots.
Oh, that's funny.
I suppose it's a release and it's an escape, but it's also in some cases an affirmation that there's more out there that we still don't have.
Very fun. So let's phrase that question differently. What voices are you listening to in the world of educational technology? You're clearly, in my mind, a leading voice, but who are you listening to, and who are you paying attention to?
Well, again, this may not be the answer you like, Steve, but my primary voice that I listen to are the students. Whether it's one of our 6-year-old second graders, whether it's one of our 12-year-old middle school students, or whether it's one of our 16-year-old juniors, I'm listening to them. I'm watching them. I'm observing them. I'm seeing what they're doing, both in school, but also in the hallway, in the malls, on the streets, in the library. Because what I'm trying to, again, is I'm trying to see what our students are doing with their learning once they get outside of our school halls, as well as what they're doing inside. And so, I'm not a big fan of futurists, if you will. That's, I guess, one of my weaknesses. I just get antsy when I'm sitting and listening to someone who's prognosticating, because I think quite often you make your future based on decisions on what you're observing around you. And the Gibson quote is still the one. In fact, that Gibson quote is part of our technology planning. We're in the midst of a new 3-year technology planning process, and the fact that the future is here. It's just not widely distributed yet. I mean, that's a key quote with our video in our technology planning process.
Do you have a MySpace account?
I am no longer using MySpace. In fact, many of our students are no longer using MySpace since Facebook has allowed different accounts. People are tending to move in that direction.
Do you blog?
I do not blog myself regularly. I contribute to blogs, yes, because even though I don't read a lot of scholarly books, I do try and keep track of what I'll call scholarly blogs, if you will, whether it's a Will Richardson type blog or any number of those folks, yes, and so I contribute. I do not write my own blog. I do try and maintain websites still that I gather resources on, and I collaborate in that fashion.
Have you found a compatibility with your own work style with wikis at all?
Well, for internal use only, yes. But as we look at project work, yes. In the work that I do with other professional organizations, I haven't gone to that point yet.
Have you found any teachers or students for whom the uses of some of these new technologies are just not necessarily the most conducive to their learning styles? Is there any
Yeah.
danger that we're going so far in one direction that we're going to end up excluding a different set of people?
There's no question, and that's one of the reasons, Steve. In our environment, we're not pushing to a one-to-one environment that where our school system would provide a laptop, for example, for every student. I'm very much a believer in the fact that our classrooms need to be multitasking environments. They need to certainly keep in mind differentiation needs of students, but more importantly, the fact that students are collaborating in different ways within the classroom at the same time. And so I'm very much a believer in that we still have students who need teacher interaction all the time. In fact, every student needs teacher interaction every day. And so our classrooms are set up so that we do have that ability for teachers to work with groups of students, with individual students, as well as the entire classroom of students. And that's part of our teaching strategies throughout our K-12 system. I think that's very important. And yet, so I think we can overdo the technology on occasion, but the reverse is almost worse. As I look at our students who are economically disadvantaged, quite often the only experience they get with certain technology tools is in our classrooms. And when I see firsthand at a local Walmart store or Target, where the only application now is a kiosk, and a parent to get that job has to be able to operate that kiosk, and I watch one of our 8-year-olds guiding their parent through the process, I know we've been successful because of the experience we've given that. The leadership, from the school board to the superintendent down to our cabinet, is very quickly coming to the realization that we can't do business as we've done it in the past if we want to continue to challenge all our students, but also provide our students the opportunity to achieve it at the highest level that they're capable of doing. I think we're seeing the fact that students in their way of communicating, when they leave our classrooms, that's when their true learning sometimes begins. We've got to make sure that we're leveraging how they're learning when they leave our classrooms. So many of us grew up in a classroom where we were given the knowledge, if you will. We weren't allowed to create the knowledge based on our experiences or based on our ability to find information. That's got to change, and training is a big part of making that change happen. The students, when they leave our classrooms, self-manage their